I first noticed something was wrong on a cold morning in early 1987, when the sun was just beginning to stretch across the empty Wyoming plains. The light came in low and gold, sharp enough to draw a clean outline around everything it touched. I remember standing outside my truck, rubbing warmth back into my fingers, when I saw my own shadow lean forward, just a fraction. Before I did, it was small enough to blame on tired eyes or the slope of the ground, but it stayed in my mind like a splinter. Wyoming was quieter back then, or maybe I was. I lived miles from the nearest neighbor, surrounded by open land that carried every sound for impossible distances. Most mornings felt the same. Start the engine, let the heater fight its slow battle, watch the sun rise over the wide, empty fields. But that day, as I walked toward the driver's door, my shadow took a step before I lifted my boot. A clean, unmistakable step, the kind that makes your breath pause, just for a moment, because your senses can't agree on what they saw. I tried to laugh it off inside the cab, but my hands were shaking on the wheel. Shadows don't act on their own. Shadows don't anticipate you. Still, I kept driving, hoping distance would scrub the memory clean. The road stretched endlessly ahead, pale and silent, the kind of silence that makes you feel like time itself has slowed down just to watch you. A few miles later, I stopped again to check the tailgate. The sun was higher now, brighter, harsher. I walked around to the back of the truck, and that's when it happened a second time. My shadow reached the bumper before I took the final step, not by much, a second, maybe less, but enough to know it wasn't an accident. And when I leaned down to look closer at the latch, my shadow didn't lean with me. It stayed upright, waiting, like it knew something I didn't. That was the moment I understood this wasn't about light, or angles, or exhaustion. Something else was happening, something tied to time itself, and whatever it was, it had already started following me. For most of my life, I didn't pay attention to things like shadows. They were just there, a consequence of standing in the sun, something you don't question, the same way you don't question the wind or the slow passing of the seasons. But after that morning on the plains, I found myself watching my shadow the way you watch a stranger who keeps glancing your way, pretending you're not bothered while your pulse betrays you. Maybe it was age or loneliness or the quiet routines I'd settled into, but I couldn't shake the feeling that time itself had shifted slightly, like a loose floorboard under my feet. I lived in a small rental on the outskirts of Rawlins back then, a place where the nights stretched on forever and the days felt too similar to separate. I had a simple job at the county's maintenance yard, patching rural roads and clearing snow in the winter. Nothing in my life hinted at anything unusual. No strange family stories, no childhood visions, no unexplained coincidences. Just long stretches of silence broken only by the rumble of a truck or the low hum of wind over dry grass. But once you see your shadow move before you do, the world doesn't look the same anymore. You start paying attention to things you used to ignore. The angle of light, the rhythm of your steps, where the sun sits at different times of day. I found myself hesitating before opening doors, before turning corners, before leaning down to tie my boots, half expecting to see my shadow react before I did. At first, I blamed stress, long hours, lack of sleep, the isolation of those endless roads. But the more I tried to rationalize it, the more the memory sharpened instead of fading. A clean step, a small delay, a tiny slip in the order of things, and it wasn't long before the pattern repeated, subtle at first, then unmistakably real. I didn't know then that the shadow wasn't the problem. It was a sign, a signal of something waiting in the spaces between my seconds, something I was about to learn the hard way. Hi, my name is Elias Turner. If you're enjoying this story so far, I'd really appreciate it if you could subscribe to the channel. It helps me keep sharing these strange moments from my life. Have you ever felt like something around you was slightly out of sync with time? Thank you for being here with me. Now, let's get back to the story. I woke before sunrise the next day, long before my alarm had the chance to ring. Sleep didn't come in full pieces that night. It came in thin layers, peeling away every time I replayed the same impossible scene in my head. My shadow, stepping ahead of me on the dirt beside the truck. A quiet second that didn't fit anywhere in the order of things. I kept telling myself it had to be a trick of the light or some flaw in my tired eyes, but the memory stayed sharp, like something I had actually touched. The house felt colder than usual when I swung my legs out of bed. Old floorboards pressed through my socks, and for a moment I stayed still, just to see if the shape on the wall would move before I did. It didn't. The darkness clung to me in all the usual ways. I let out a breath I didn't know I was holding and shuffled to the kitchen, trying to act like a man who trusted his own senses. I made coffee and sat by the small window above the sink. Outside, Wyoming was still half asleep, quiet and pale, the land stretching out like a blank page. Out there, nothing looked wrong. No twisted reflections, no strange colors in the sky, no signs that time itself had slipped. Just my truck, the storage shed, and the long fields fading into bluish gray. I wrapped my hands around the mug and watched the wall, waiting for the first strip of sunlight to slide in and draw a line across the floor. When it finally did, my heart picked up. The light caught the edge of the table, then my shoulders, then the side of my face. A shape formed on the worn boards, a familiar outline I had seen every day of my life. I stood slowly. Part of me hoped I'd imagined everything. Part of me wanted to prove I hadn't. I took a single step forward. My shadow moved first. It wasn't much, just enough for its head and shoulders to tilt before mine. A sliver of time, no more than a heartbeat, where the floor showed a version of me from half a second in the future. I felt the air leave my lungs. The room didn't tilt, the world didn't shimmer. Only that wrong, tiny delay between what I felt inside my body and what appeared on the ground. I stayed there, mid-step, listening to the refrigerator hum and the weak ticking of the wall clock. I checked the window, the angle of the light, even the position of the mug on the table, as if any of those things might explain why my shadow was no longer waiting for me. Nothing had changed. The house was the same. I was the same. But time in that small, quiet kitchen wasn't. And I realized something simple and terrifying. If my own shadow could move before me, it meant the future, at least a piece of it, was already decided, already reaching back toward me. And now I needed to know how far ahead it could go. I didn't leave the house right away. I stood there longer than I want to admit, staring at the floorboards as if the shadow might reveal some clue I had missed. But it stayed still, flat and obedient again, like nothing unusual had happened. That inconsistency, the way the strange moments started and stopped without warning, made everything worse. If something is broken, you want it broken consistently. You want rules, a pattern, anything you can hold in your hands. But this felt like trying to catch mist. Eventually, I forced myself outside. The cold morning air hit my face hard, the kind of sting that wakes you up whether you want it to or not. I walked toward the truck, half expecting my shadow to jump ahead again, but it stuck close, glued to my heels like it always had. For a tiny moment, I wondered if the kitchen light had been playing tricks on me after all. Maybe the angle inside the house had distorted something. Maybe I'd simply been too focused, too paranoid after what happened the day before. But the truth was already sitting somewhere deep in me, heavy as a stone. I knew what I saw. I climbed into the truck, left the engine idling for a minute, and tried to steady my breathing. The sky was clearer now. No clouds, no haze, just a solid stretch of pale blue with sunlight bright enough to carve sharp lines across the land. Perfect conditions to test something I wasn't ready to test. I turned off the engine, opened the door, and stepped out again. Slowly this time, deliberately, as if approaching an animal that might bolt. I positioned myself in front of the truck so the shadow cast cleanly behind me. Then I raised my right arm. My shadow raised its right arm too, perfectly in sync. I waited a beat, then lowered my arm. Again, the shadow followed without delay. Relief washed over me, thin and temporary. Maybe it would hold. Maybe the strange episodes were done, nothing more than two flukes I could bury and forget. But when I took a step to the left, my shadow slid half a second earlier, its legs stretching before mine had even shifted its weight. I froze. My heartbeat hammered in my ears. I stepped back to the right. Again, the shadow went first. It wasn't random. It wasn't glitching. It was anticipating me, reacting ahead of me the way a person might when they already know what move you're about to make. I backed up, one step, then another. The shadow didn't move early this time. It waited. Then, when I leaned forward slightly, almost too small to notice, it leaned a fraction too soon, like it was testing me the same way I was testing it. I stood there, breath white in the cold air, and understood something I hadn't allowed myself to admit before. This wasn't an illusion. It wasn't stress. It wasn't my mind. Something involving time, something quiet, deliberate, had found me. I stayed there longer than I should have, watching my shadow as if it might suddenly speak. The wind pushed lightly across the plains, carrying bits of dry grass across the dirt, but the air around me felt strangely still, like time itself was holding its breath. The sunlight was steady, no shifting clouds, no tricks from above. Everything around me was ordinary, except for the part that should have been the most ordinary of all. My shadow shouldn't have had a mind of its own, but it did. I needed to be sure of what I was seeing. I turned my back to the truck and walked toward the field. Each step crunched on frozen soil. The sun stretched my shadow far across the ground, long and thin, easy to watch. I took 3 steps. It anticipated one of them. I didn't move. It did. Then it paused again, slipping back into sync like nothing had happened. It was like watching a heartbeat that skipped at random intervals, except it wasn't random. Not anymore. I tested it in every simple way I could think of. Quick movements, slow movements, turning sharply left or right, pretending to lean, then stopping last second. My shadow didn't outpace everything. It wasn't constantly early, just the movements I intended to make. Somehow, it reacted to the decision before the muscle. It wasn't reading the light. It was reading me. My stomach twisted with a strange mix of fear and fascination. A part of me wanted to run inside and shut the blinds. Another part wanted to keep staring until I solved it, like a puzzle with a missing piece that had somehow existed all along. By the time I walked back to the truck, my hands were shaking again. I sat behind the wheel, gripping it tight enough that my knuckles turned pale. Why me? Why now? And why this? Why a shadow? I tried to replay the past few days, searching for anything unusual I might have overlooked. A feeling, a moment, a weird dream, anything. But my life had been the same predictable cycle it always was. Work, drive, home, quiet. The same roads, the same sky, the same empty stretch of Wyoming land surrounding me. Nothing had changed. Nothing except the seconds themselves. The engine rumbled when I turned the key, and for a moment the sound grounded me. Machines obey time. Engines obey time. The world obeys time. And if my shadow had stopped obeying it, then something deeper was shifting. I kept my eyes on the road as I pulled out, but every part of me was aware of the shape cast beside me on the ground. It didn't move ahead this time. It didn't betray me. But I had already seen enough to know the truth. This wasn't an accident. Whatever was happening had a direction, and it was pulling me towards something I wasn't ready to face. By the time I reached the maintenance yard on the edge of town, I felt like I'd lived an entire day before 8 in the morning. Rollins wasn't a big place in 1987, just a few main roads, a handful of shops, and long stretches of nothing between them. Most of the town was still waking up when I pulled in. The yard was quiet, the kind of quiet that felt too normal compared to what I'd left behind at home. I parked the truck and sat there for a moment, staring at my hands on the steering wheel. They looked steady, but I didn't trust them. I didn't trust my senses anymore. Not after watching my own shadow move before I did. I kept glancing at the sunlight hitting the ground outside the window, checking for even the smallest flicker of anticipation. But nothing happened. The shadow behaved. It stayed where it should be. Maybe that should have comforted me. Instead, it made my stomach knot tighter. Inside the small break room, the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. 2 of the guys, Matt and Don, were leaning over a newspaper, arguing about last week's game. I nodded to them, poured myself a cup of weak coffee, and tried to act like I belonged in a world where everything followed normal rules. But I could feel the strangeness of the morning clinging to me like dust on my clothes. "You look beat," Matt said without looking up. "Long night," I answered, which was true enough. I sat at the table, pretending to read the schedule pinned to the wall. My mind wasn't on work. It wasn't on anything except the fraction of a second when my shadow had moved early, as if it knew what I was about to do before I did. I tried to push it aside, focus on tasks, routines, anything. But the moment kept replaying itself in my head. The early lean, the step ahead, the way it hesitated afterward, like it was waiting to see whether I had noticed. When the foreman came in and handed out assignments, I almost didn't hear him. My brain felt half a second behind, as if I were the one out of sync now. I took my clipboard and headed back outside, the sunlight hitting me square in the face as I stepped out the door. That's when it happened again. I was still walking, still mid-stride, when the corner of my eye caught it, my shadow's head turning a fraction earlier than mine. A tiny anticipatory motion, almost too small to be sure of, but I was sure. I stopped immediately, breath caught in my throat. The shadow stopped too, perfectly in sync again, like a child snapping to attention after being caught misbehaving. A cold ripple moved through me. This wasn't just happening when I tested it. It was happening when I wasn't ready. And that meant it wasn't reacting to the light. It was reacting to me. I stood there longer than I meant to, staring at the ground like a man waiting for something to reveal itself. Nothing did. The shadow stayed perfectly still now, perfectly loyal, as if it had never stepped ahead of me in the first place. A truck rumbled somewhere behind the storage bay, the metallic clang of tools echoing through the yard, grounding the morning in normalcy. But normal didn't feel like a place I could reach anymore. I forced myself to keep walking, clipboard in hand. Every step felt exaggerated, as if I had to consciously think about lifting each foot from the ground. My eyes kept flicking downward, checking for any break in rhythm, any sign of what had happened a moment before. But the shadow behaved. It matched me perfectly once again. No hesitation, no early moves, nothing. I should have been relieved. I wasn't. The assignment for the day was routine. Check the drainage near County Road 12 and the connecting dirt lanes behind it. It was familiar work, the sort that didn't require much thought. Usually I welcomed that kind of monotony. But on that morning, monotony made the strange moments stand out even sharper, like small fractures in a smooth surface. I climbed into one of the work trucks, the older Ford with the rattling mirror. As I pulled out of the yard, the sun cast my shadow long across the seat beside me, distorted slightly by the window's angle. I drove slower than usual, and I kept my eyes on the movement of the silhouette on the dashboard, waiting, maybe even bracing, for something to happen. Miles passed. Nothing happened. The shadow stayed obedient during the entire drive down the long stretch of road. My shoulders relaxed a little despite myself. Thoughts that had been rigid softened just enough for doubt to slip in. Maybe the earlier moments were tricks of the eye. Maybe exhaustion really was catching up to me. Maybe. I stopped the truck. I didn't know why I stopped, not exactly. Something inside me just froze. And then I felt it, the unmistakable sense that my body wanted to turn its head, to glance toward the fence line on the right. I hadn't moved yet, but I was about to. My shadow already had. In the sunlight hitting the dirt beside the truck, the dark shape had tilted, just slightly, toward the fence. My head hadn't turned. My eyes hadn't shifted, but the shadow had reacted to the intention forming in my mind, not the movement. A chill spilled across my arms. I turned my head for real this time, slowly, following the direction the shadow had indicated. Nothing was there, just open land, dead grass, and silence. But the message was clear. My shadow was no longer responding to what I did. It was responding to what I was going to do. I stayed there, parked on the side of that empty Wyoming road, feeling the cold through the windshield even with the engine still humming. The land around me was silent in a way that made every thought louder. Nothing moved. No cattle, no trucks in the distance, not even the wind bending the grass. It was the kind of stillness that felt staged, like the world was holding position just to see what I would do next. My shadow, stretched wide on the dirt outside my door, had already returned to perfect alignment. No early tilt, no jump ahead, just a dark outline sitting exactly where it belonged. If someone else had stood there with me, they would have seen a perfectly normal silhouette, but I knew better. I had watched it turn before I even allowed myself to think about turning. I stepped out of the truck slowly, each movement measured. Sunlight hit my back, warm despite the cool breeze. My shadow formed clearly on the ground ahead of me, long and thin, pointing toward the fence line that had drawn my attention. I took one step forward. The shadow didn't jump ahead. It waited for me this time. That almost made it worse, like it could choose when to reveal itself, when to obey and when not to. I walked toward the fence, gravel crunching beneath my boots. 50 feet out, then 30, then 20. Still nothing, just open land. When I reached the fence, I rested my hands on the wood. It was old, dry, sun-bleached, rough. Something about its age made me feel steadier. This fence had belonged to a world that made sense, a world where shadows didn't think faster than the people who cast them. I glanced down. My shadow was perfectly still, as if posing for a photograph. I bent slightly, picking up a small stone beside my boot. I held it in my hand, just for a second, before the idea even reached the muscles in my arm, and that's when it moved. The shadow of my arm lifted before I actually threw the stone. Barely a second early, but undeniably early. I felt my breath catch in my chest. Then, when I actually did throw it, the shadow snapped back into perfect sync, as if correcting a mistake. I stood there with my pulse pounding, watching the stone bounce off the dirt a few yards away. My real arm trembled. The shadow's arm stayed steady. That tiny flicker of anticipation wasn't random. It wasn't reacting to light or angle or movement. It was reacting to choice, thought, intention. Something inside me tightened. A knot of fear mixed with something else I didn't want to name. Because if my shadow was showing me a moment before I lived it, then maybe the boundary between what I had done and what I was going to do was thinner than I ever realized. I drove back toward County Road 12 with a feeling I couldn't shake, like the world was a half step ahead of me, even when it looked exactly the same. For the rest of the morning, I worked the way I always did, clearing small debris from the ditches, checking culverts, marking a few spots that needed patching. But everything felt distant, as if my body was going through familiar motions while my mind lagged somewhere behind. Every so often, I'd catch the outline of my shadow stretching beside me, and each time, my stomach tightened, waiting for it to move before me again. Sometimes it didn't. Sometimes it was perfectly normal, matching every shift in my shoulders and every step of my boots. But other times, those small, quick, subtle times, it jumped a fraction early. A tilt of the head, a shift of weight, a movement anticipating my own before I'd committed to it. There was no pattern I could trust, only moments. It felt like trying to predict lightning. By noon, clouds had rolled in from the west, thinning the sunlight but not enough to erase the shadow entirely. I crouched beside a drainage pipe, marking a spot with chalk. As I stood up, I felt a strange sensation, a tightening in my chest, like a sense that I was about to turn left. My body didn't move yet. My shadow did. It turned its head toward the road, half a second early. I jerked in the same direction, unthinking, but there was nothing there. Just the long, empty stretch, a distant fence, and the low gray sky. A slight tremor passed through my fingers. I needed answers. I needed something to compare this to, someone to tell me whether I was losing my grip or whether something beyond me was taking shape. But who do you talk to about something like this? Who do you look in the eye and say, "My shadow knows what I'm about to do"? Not Matt, not Don, not anyone at the yard. I kept working, trying to bury the thoughts under routine. But by afternoon, the sky had darkened and the wind had picked up. The land felt heavier, as if pressing down on me. I finished the last stretch of the route and climbed into the truck, but instead of heading back to the yard, I found myself turning onto a side road, one that led to a place I hadn't visited in years, an old field station, long abandoned by the county. I didn't know why I drove there. The decision happened so quickly that I couldn't tell whether it came from me or from the strange anticipation I kept feeling inside my own movements. When I stepped out of the truck at the edge of the property, the wind quieted for the first time all day. The building stood silent, leaning slightly, its windows dark and empty. I felt something familiar rise inside me. Not fear, recognition, as if whatever was happening had been waiting for me to return to this place. The field station looked smaller than I remembered. Back in the early 80s, we used it during heavy snow seasons, or when certain routes became too remote for daily trips. It had been abandoned for at least 5 years by then, left to tilt under the Wyoming wind, its walls fading from white to dull gray. I hadn't set foot near it since the last winter I worked out here, yet standing in front of it now, the place felt strangely familiar, almost expectant. I walked toward the door, boots sinking slightly into the soft ground. My shadow stretched long ahead of me, its edges blurred by the overcast sky. The sun wasn't strong enough to give it sharp definition, but it was still there, still tracking me closely. Or at least pretending to. When I reached the door, I hesitated. Something inside me tugged. a sense that I was about to lift my hand to the rusted handle. I hadn't moved yet. The thought was only starting to form. My shadow raised its arm first, just a few inches, just enough to make my heart jump. I pulled my hand back instinctively, breath catching in my throat. The shadow froze, arm suspended, waiting. It wasn't just anticipating movement now. It was anticipating hesitation. It seemed to know the decision before I committed to it. I backed away slowly, eyes fixed on the dark outline. The wind brushed past me, nudging the tall grass. The clouds shifted, letting just enough sun through to sharpen the edges of the silhouette. It still held its arm raised. I didn't move. Neither did it. Then, as if realizing I wasn't going to follow through, the shadow's arm lowered, smoothly, quietly, and not in sync with my own movements. My hands were still at my sides, but my shadow had made its own decision. Fear wasn't the right word for what I felt. It was something closer to the moment before fear. A slow, cold awareness spreading through me that, whatever this was, it wasn't random. And it wasn't just a glitch in perception or timing. It was communication. The thought came uninvited, but it stuck to me like frost on glass. What if the shadow wasn't malfunctioning? What if it was trying to tell me something, or worse, warn me? I forced myself to walk around the building's left side, keeping distance between me and the shifting shape beneath me. The land dipped slightly, and my shadow stretched long across the uneven ground. I tested it again. I stepped. It stepped. I paused. It paused. Then, when I turned my head toward the back of the property, it turned early, a full second early. My chest tightened. I followed its direction slowly, even though everything in me resisted. And behind the station, half hidden in tall dead grass, something caught the light. Something I hadn't expected to see out here. Something I remembered, but had no reason to remember. At first I thought it was just metal, scrap blown by the wind or something left behind from the station's last season. But as I stepped closer, pushing through the tall, brittle grass, the shape sharpened into something more familiar. A piece of reflective glass, a curved edge, a frame corroded by years of cold and heat. It was a mirror, small, handheld, the kind someone might keep in a glove compartment or old toolbox. I had no memory of ever seeing it here, but the moment my eyes landed on the faded handle, something inside me tightened, a faint recognition that didn't belong to any clear memory I had. My shadow stretched beside me, long and still. The clouds thinned overhead, letting a soft slice of sunlight fall across the mirror. I crouched slowly and reached for it, watching the silhouette of my arm on the ground as much as the object itself. The shadow didn't move first this time. It followed me exactly. My fingers brushed the cold metal, and then the shadow did something I didn't expect. It didn't anticipate me. It hesitated. Just a fraction. Just enough for me to feel the delay. Not early, not predictive, but late. Like it was unsure. Like my intention didn't match what it expected me to do. A chill moved down my spine. I picked up the mirror and turned it over in my hands. The glass was cracked in one corner but not shattered. The back had a faint engraving, worn and impossible to read. I wiped the surface with my sleeve, trying to catch my reflection. Nothing seemed unusual about the object itself, but the weight of it felt wrong, like picking up an item you forgot you owned, and remembering a memory that isn't yours. I angled the mirror downward toward the ground, not to see my face, to see the shadow. Its outline stretched across the dirt, matching my pose. No anticipations, no delays, just the ordinary shape of a man holding something small in his hand. But then, as I shifted the mirror slightly, catching a different angle of the light, my shadow moved, not in sync, not early. It stepped backward. My real feet stayed planted in the same spot. The movement was small, subtle, almost cautious, like it wanted distance from the object in my hand. I lowered the mirror instantly, pulse hammering in my throat. The shadow snapped back into alignment the moment the glass pointed away from it. "What the hell?" I whispered, but the wind swallowed the words. I held the mirror at my side, unsure whether to drop it or grip it tighter. My shadow didn't move. It didn't anticipate. It didn't retreat. It just waited. A cold realization slid through me, quiet and undeniable. Whatever was happening with my shadow wasn't just connected to me. It was connected to whatever I had just picked up. And somehow, deep down, I sensed this object wasn't new in my life. I had held it before, even if I couldn't remember when. I didn't leave the field station right away. I stood there with the mirror in my hand, feeling its weight shift slightly as the wind moved around me. The object looked ordinary, cheap even, something you'd expect to find in a gas station or a forgotten drawer. But the moment I picked it up, something in the world had reacted. Not the air, not the land, my shadow. It stayed aligned now, perfectly obedient, as if the moment of hesitation had been an accident, a glitch in reality I wasn't meant to catch. But I had caught it, and the more I stared at the dark shape beside me, the more I felt as though it were watching me back. I turned the mirror in my hand, angling it carefully. I didn't want to trigger whatever had happened before, not without understanding it. The cracked glass caught a thin slice of afternoon light, scattering it across the ground in trembling shards. I lifted it just slightly, just enough to let the reflection fall across the earth. My shadow didn't move early. It didn't move late. It didn't move at all. It waited. I lowered the mirror. The shadow shifted with me, perfectly in sync. But even in that normal movement, something about it felt tense, like a held breath. I walked slowly around the back of the station, trying to calm the restless thoughts building in the pit of my stomach. The wooden frame creaked in the wind, and a piece of metal siding flapped loosely against the wall. The land beyond stretched endlessly. Brown grass, thin patches of snow, nothing but open space. You wouldn't think anything strange could exist here, but something had been left behind, something waiting for me to find it. When I reached the far side of the building, I noticed an old concrete step half buried in the ground, a remnant of a structure that must have stood here long before the station was built. I knelt beside it, brushing away dirt with the toe of my boot. Not much remained, just faint lines carved into the surface. Markings, not words, not symbols I recognized. Lines, crossed lines, a pattern that seemed almost familiar. The mirror felt heavier in my hand. I angled it down again, letting its reflection slide toward the markings. My shadow lengthened beside me, stretching across the concrete. For the first time since this all began, it didn't follow the movement of the mirror. It stepped away from it, a small, careful step backward. My entire body went still. I wasn't imagining this. The mirror wasn't just an object, and the shadow wasn't just reacting to me. It was reacting to it. I stood slowly, holding the mirror tight, feeling the roughness of the cracked handle dig into my palm. The markings on the concrete stared up at me, faint but undeniable. Something had happened here, something involving this mirror, something my shadow remembered, even if I didn't. I stepped back from the concrete slab and let the wind cut across my face. The air felt thinner here, sharper, as if the land itself held an old memory just beneath the surface. I didn't recognize the markings carved into the stone, but something about them made my skin crawl. Not from fear, but from a strange, almost physical déjà vu. The kind that doesn't come from the mind, but from the body. Like stepping somewhere you've been before, even though you know you haven't. The mirror weighed down my hand. I kept glancing between it and the shadow beside me, searching for the slightest twitch. But the shadow stayed uneasily normal, clinging to my movements with the precision of something trying too hard to behave. I didn't trust it. Not after everything it had shown me. I crouched again, brushing more dirt off the markings. The lines formed intersecting angles, some shallow, some deep, almost like a diagram or map. But a map of what? The area around the station was flat, empty for miles. No creeks, no trails, nothing that would need marking. As I traced the grooves with my eyes, a thought slid into my mind quietly, like a whisper sneaking in under a door. You've seen this before. It made no sense, but it didn't feel wrong. I looked down at the mirror again. My reflection stared back. Tired eyes, unshaven jaw, lines on my forehead from too many sleepless nights. Normal. Completely normal. But when I angled the mirror to catch the ground behind me, the reflection bent strangely along the cracked corner. A distortion. A warping of the shadow's outline. My shadow's outline. I held my breath, lifting the mirror slightly. The shadow in the reflection twitched, barely, but enough to make my hand shake. It wasn't anticipating me this time. It was reacting to being seen. I lowered the mirror quickly. The shadow snapped back into perfect shape on the ground at my feet. Something inside me began to tighten. Not panic, not fear, but an urgent need to understand what I was standing in the middle of. The mirror. The markings. The shadow's behavior. None of it felt random. I looked around the edges of the station. Old nails stuck out of the siding. A length of rusted cable lay half buried in the dirt. Broken boards leaned at strange angles, as if they'd been torn off long before I ever worked here. The place felt older than its years, as if time had moved differently around it. Something brushed my attention, a flicker of movement at the very edge of my vision. I turned sharply. My shadow had shifted its stance, just a few inches, just enough to look like it was facing the concrete markings, even though I wasn't. A slow coldness spread through me. It wasn't predicting my movements now. It was remembering something I hadn't done yet, something connected to those carvings, and to this mirror in my hand. I didn't move at first. I just stood there watching the shadow tilt toward the markings, as if it had been waiting for me to look in that direction. The wind pressed lightly against my jacket, carrying that faint scent of cold dirt and old wood that always lingered around forgotten structures. Nothing else shifted. Not the tall grass, not the clouds, not the brittle siding of the building. Only my shadow. I forced myself to breathe slowly, keeping my eyes locked on the dark shape beside me. If it was remembering something, some event, some moment, then what exactly was it trying to lead me toward, or away from? I stepped closer to the concrete slab. This time, the shadow didn't anticipate me. It didn't retreat. It simply matched my stride as though nothing unusual had ever happened. But the sense of intention lingered in the air, a quiet pressure that made the back of my neck prickle. I knelt again, mirror in hand, and traced the carvings with my fingers. The grooves felt colder than the stone around them. As I leaned in, the cracked corner of the mirror accidentally caught the sunlight and reflected a thin strip of distorted light across the slab. My shadow twitched. Not early, not late, sideways. As if reacting to something in the reflection itself, I angled the mirror intentionally this time, letting the warped beam slide over different parts of the markings. Most of the time, nothing happened. But when the reflection passed over one particular set of lines, 3 intersecting grooves forming a crooked X, the shadow jerked subtly, like a recoil. My real body didn't move at all. I lowered the mirror quickly, heart hammering. Whatever these markings represented, the shadow recognized them. Not with memory in the human sense, but with something deeper. Instinct, familiarity, maybe even caution. I stood and backed up a few steps. The shadow aligned perfectly with me again. The silence around the station thickened, pressing against my ears. I felt like I was standing inside a memory I hadn't lived yet. I scanned the ground, the siding, the patch of grass where the mirror had been half hidden. Nothing explained why it was here. Nothing explained why the markings existed. Nothing explained why my shadow reacted to both. Unless a quiet thought crept up inside me, cold and unwelcome. What if this place was connected to me in ways I didn't remember? I rubbed the cracked handle of the mirror with my thumb, feeling the old surface, trying to place it somewhere in my life. But there was nothing. No memory of owning it. No memory of losing it. And yet the recognition was too strong to ignore. I took one last look at the carvings. The crooked X seemed to pulse in my peripheral vision, as if the land itself was trying to direct me towards something just out of reach. My shadow didn't move, but I felt it waiting, not for my next step, for my next realization. Whatever this was, whatever tied my shadow, the mirror, and this place together, it wasn't random. It was history. Mine, or someone's I was connected to. I left the concrete slab behind slowly, as if stepping away from it too quickly might wake something I didn't understand yet. The air felt different now, thicker, heavier, carrying that subtle tension you feel when you know a truth is close, even if you can't name it. My boots pressed into the soft earth behind the station, each step leaving a clear print. My shadow followed, steady and obedient again, but I could no longer pretend it hadn't shown me more than I wanted to see. The mirror felt almost warm in my hand, though the Wyoming air was cold enough to sting. I kept turning it over, studying the cracks, the worn edges, the faint engraving that time had almost erased. Something about holding it gave me the odd sensation of déjà vu, not the mental kind, but something deeper. Like my body recognized the weight even though my mind refused to form any memory of it. I walked toward the far fence line, needing distance, needing space to think. The land stretched out wide in every direction, open and empty, with nothing but dry grass and distant hills breaking the horizon. Normally, the vastness calmed me. Wyoming has a way of making your worries feel small. But today, every open space felt like it carried a question. I lifted the mirror again, just slightly, letting the reflection fall near my feet. My shadow formed cleanly in its surface. I watched it carefully, waiting for anything. Any flicker, any delayed movement, any early shift. Nothing. It stayed still, until I lowered the mirror. The shadow leaned forward first. A small movement, barely noticeable unless you were watching for it. But I was watching. I had been watching since the moment this began. My breath caught in my throat. The shadow straightened again, perfectly aligned, perfectly silent. It wasn't random. It wasn't malfunctioning. It was communicating. I wasn't sure how I knew that, but the certainty settled in me like a weight. I moved the mirror again, slowly, cautiously. The shadow stayed in sync, but when I lowered it, when the mirror's surface pointed toward the markings behind the station, the shadow stiffened. A tension ran through the shape on the ground, something subtle, like a held breath. I followed its direction, turning just enough to see the old slab again. The crooked X carved into the concrete seemed darker from this angle, deeper, like the lines held a shadow of their own. That's when a memory, not clear, not complete, just a fragment, flashed across my mind. A winter day, snow, a younger version of me standing near a structure that wasn't this station, but wasn't far from it, and something in my hand, something with a cracked corner. The moment vanished as quickly as it came, leaving only the echo of a feeling. I had been here before, not in a way I remembered, but in a way my shadow did. I closed my eyes, gripping the mirror tighter. Whatever was happening hadn't started today, or yesterday, or even this year. This was something old, something that had been waiting for me to notice. And I had finally stepped into the second where it could reach me. I opened my eyes slowly, letting the cold Wyoming air settle into my lungs. The fragment of memory still pulsed faintly behind my ribs, like an echo I couldn't fully catch. Snow, a younger version of myself, the shape of a structure that didn't match the field station, but stood somewhere near it, and the cracked mirror, this same mirror, in my younger hand. It didn't make sense. Memory shouldn't come back like that, out of order, out of time. I turned the mirror again, running my thumb along the fracture in the glass. It felt familiar in a way that tightened something inside me. The kind of familiarity that didn't belong to a distant object, but to a moment lived once and forgotten for reasons you don't understand. The wind shifted slightly, moving the grass in small waves. My shadow stretched evenly across the ground, long and thin beneath the afternoon light. At first, it looked perfectly normal. Then, so subtly it almost escaped my notice, it leaned again, just a fraction, just enough to mimic the feeling inside me, the pull toward something buried further back on the property. "Where are you trying to take me?" I murmured under my breath. The shadow didn't answer, of course, but it didn't need to. Even in stillness, it felt expectant. I turned from the fence and walked slowly along the back wall of the station, letting my boots sink into the soft ground. The building creaked against the wind, its boards shifting like old bones. I followed a path I didn't fully recognize, but that my body moved through with an ease that unsettled me. Then I saw it, a depression in the earth, shallow, almost invisible unless you were searching. A faint rectangle carved by time, softened by seasons of wind and snow. I stopped at its edge, heart thudding heavier than before. The shape wasn't large, maybe 6 feet wide, maybe 8 long, like the outline of something that had once stood there. I crouched beside it, holding the mirror loosely. My shadow fell across the shallow dip in the earth, stretching from one end to the other. I waited, watching. At first nothing happened. Then the shadow shifted backward, steady, intentional, until its head aligned with a corner of the depression. Not early, not predictive. A placement, a marking, as if showing me exactly where I had once stood. That faint fragment of memory pulsed again. Snow, cold, breath in the air, my younger hands gripping something, a shape behind me, a feeling I couldn't place. My breath shook as I whispered. I was here, not a guess, a certainty. The shadow straightened the moment the words left my mouth. I looked down at the mirror, at its cracks, at the faint engraving I still couldn't read. A thought formed slowly, carefully, as if it already knew it had been waiting for me. Maybe this wasn't about what the mirror was now. Maybe it was about what it had been then. And maybe my shadow wasn't remembering for me. Maybe it was remembering me. I stood over that shallow rectangle in the earth, gripping the mirror harder than I meant to. The shape felt like a footprint left by time itself, something that had settled into the land long before today, long before I returned here. The wind brushed lightly across the field, and the faint smell of cold soil rose around me. Everything felt still, too still, like the moment before someone speaks a truth they're afraid to hear. My shadow stretched across the dip in the ground, perfectly aligned now, not anticipating, not retreating, waiting. I stepped into the shallow depression. A soft jolt ran through my body, not painful, not electric, but familiar, like the sensation you get when you walk into a room you haven't seen since childhood. My breath caught. My hands trembled around the edges of the mirror, and then, slowly, something inside me loosened, as if a memory buried under years of routine finally found space to breathe. I closed my eyes. Snow. A younger me, breath fogging the air. A building, not the field station, but something older beside it. The mirror in my hand. A sound, metal hitting stone. A voice. Not clear, just the tone of one. And my shadow, moving before I did, the same way it had now. I opened my eyes sharply, gasping as if I'd been underwater. The shadow at my feet flickered, just once, as though the memory had passed through it too. This wasn't the first time. This was a return. I crouched, lowering the mirror slightly, and watched the reflection tremble across the disturbed earth. The shadow moved in the glass almost imperceptibly, but enough to stir that strange recognition in me again. Not a full memory, just a sense of being part of something larger than the moment I was standing in. I angled the mirror toward the horizon, letting its cracked glass distort the pale sky. The wind settled. The sun pressed through a gap in the clouds. My shadow sharpened on the ground, and for the first time it didn't wait for me. It stepped forward, not early, not late, just decisively forward, into a spot on the ground a few inches ahead of my boots. A clear, deliberate movement, as if choosing a place. A moment. My heart hammered against my ribs. I didn't move. The shadow stayed ahead. Then, slowly, steadily, it turned its head to the right. I followed its direction, breath thin and tight, expecting, I don't know what. A figure, a structure, some clear explanation waiting in the grass or dirt. But there was nothing, only open land. Yet something in that empty space felt heavy, as if it held the outline of a moment I hadn't reached yet, or one I had already lived. The shadow returned to its usual shape the instant I stepped back, but the message lingered. It wasn't showing me what had happened. It was showing me what was connected, and for the first time I wasn't sure whether the next moment belonged to my past or my future. I left the field station long after the sun had begun to sink, its last light stretching my shadow across the dirt like a quiet reminder of everything I still didn't understand. The mirror felt heavier as I slipped it into the glove compartment of my truck, and for a moment I hesitated before closing it, half expecting the shadow on the ground to react. But it didn't. It only stood beside me, calm again, as if the day hadn't happened at all. Driving home, the land felt different, though nothing had changed. The same fences, the same empty fields, the same long stretches of road that used to feel like habits I could fall into without thinking. But my mind wasn't quiet. My thoughts kept circling that fragment of memory. The snow, the structure, the feeling of something slipping between one second and the next. When I reached my house, the simplest things felt unfamiliar. The porch steps, the worn door frame, even the kitchen light. I moved slowly, watching my shadow move with me, waiting for another early shift, another hesitation, another sign that time was still bending in the places I wasn't looking. But nothing happened that night, or the next. For a while, things seemed normal again. Still, the mirror remained in that glove compartment, and every morning I found myself checking the angle of the sunlight against the floorboards. Not out of fear, not anymore, but out of a quiet understanding that whatever had happened at that station hadn't finished with me. Maybe it never would, because sometimes when I walk past the kitchen window or step out into the early Wyoming light, I still feel that faint pull, like a moment I haven't reached yet is tugging gently at the edge of my life. And every now and then, just before I move, I see my shadow shift. as if reminding me that time isn't always moving in the direction we imagine.